Hey YouTube, Jacob Beach with the Preppers Bunker Outdoors, and finally we have a verdict in the battle of the budget choppers. It's long awaited. I'd like to say first that I really wanted to award points on the specifications episode based on things like for a large knife 5160 being superior to 1095, 1095 Crovan being superior to 1095, differential hardening being superior to standard or full hardening, and maybe full tang being superior to a rat tang, so on and so forth. But all of those things I think are subjective. So I could not in good conscience rate any of these knives based on their specifications. So without further ado, I'm going to take you through the points layout, who won the competition, and then who I think won, which one I would choose personally. So let's get started. We'll work our way from last to first. Last place with 11 points was the Ontario Sp10 Marine Raider Bowie. Although it did really well at chopping through the cantaloupe and the watermelon, this knife just did not perform well anywhere else. And when compared back to back with these other knives, the Sp10 just couldn't hang in there. The next four knives were all very close. So in fourth place was a very surprising Becker Bk9. When all the variables were controlled and my subjective opinions were taken out of it, it just didn't quite do what I expected it to do. It got fourth place with 19 points. In third place, again a very surprising contender here, the Ontario Sp5 Survival Bowie. They call this a survival knife, and you know what, I can't argue with them. It did really well. It was a pretty even contender all around, but it just surprisingly did extremely well on batoning. This is a sweet knife, especially for the price. Alright, so for second place, let's get a little drum roll here. Second place was a tie. The Ontario RTAK 2 and the ex-Gurkha Kukri House Traditional Service Kukri tied for first place with 22 points. It's kind of odd that both of these knives are made out of 5160, but they both had their strong points. They're both probably the most powerful knives out of this group when it comes to weight distribution and stuff like that. But in every single area, both of them performed pretty well. The Ontario is probably a little bit more even. It did well in a lot of categories, and the Kukri lagged behind in a couple categories, but in a couple categories it really, really shined. So for first place, if I'm not going to be subjective, came to these two guys. Awesome knives, especially for the price. Kukri's about 70 bucks. RTAK 2's $100 to $110. Both of these knives are just a steal. Alright, so trying to not be subjective during this test was the hardest thing that I did. And so now I want to talk about which knives I would choose. Obviously, the first one would be this Kukri. I carry this everywhere. At this point, it's way more dull than any of the other knives because I've used the crap out of it. I've beaten it. It shows its age, it shows its use. When I started using this knife at the beginning of this competition, I fell in love with it. It really matches my style very well, and it's a great knife. But what I'd like to talk about is not necessarily this Kukri. What I'd like to talk about is the Becker Bk9. If it weren't for the Kukri, regardless of this test, this is probably the knife that I would have chosen. It's got a saber grind, which I don't like as much as a full flat grind, but it's a fairly high saber grind, and the knife isn't that thick. So it works very well, as you could see in the test. But more importantly, these grips are just great. You know, I can work for a really long time with this Becker here and not really get any hot spots. Now I do have some vibration. My hands will get sore, but with a full tang it's hard to get around that. But Ethan Becker put a lot of experience with knives into these grips, and it shows. It's not just something that got designed by a board of designers. It's not something that was chosen for economical reasons. These grips are just right. And the other things I like about this knife, the finish wore more than any other knife. Obviously, I don't really care about the finish. You know, part of owning a Becker is stripping the finish, doing what you want to the knife, modifying it a little bit, putting new scales on, which is really nice. This is probably the easiest knife to change scales on, although the RTAK 2 is very nice too. But it just fits right. And if you are going to work for a long time with a knife, you don't want sticky grips. I started out thinking that with a very popular knife that cost well over $300 with micarta grips with filework in them. Filework kind of similar to this. This is completely separate, doesn't have anything to do with this review. But I don't want to name the manufacturer because people lose their minds. But I carried it in Afghanistan, and I was making some tent stakes up on an observation point, and it tore my hand up bad. It was a terrible knife. Incredibly popular. Everybody thinks so highly of it. Just a piece of junk. And so even after that, I was still thinking that I wanted a lot of traction in my knife handles, and they just keep beating my hands up. And I started to learn that for a large knife, you want a smooth handle that's not going to tear your skin up, but you want a well-designed shape to that handle so that you don't lose the knife. So this knife can slip a little bit in my hands, but even if it's doing that, it's not going to tear it up. I'm not going to lose my grip on this knife because this grip is just well-designed. So I love the Becker Bk9. It's probably part of why I'm a Becker head. This knife really started me on the big knife craze, and it's going to be one of my favorite knives until my Bk4 gets here. Then maybe I'll change my mind, and maybe until the Bk21 comes out, finally, someday. Cabe, are you listening? Bring the Bk21 out. I've been waiting for months. I will buy it immediately and review it. But they call this knife the King, and they call it that for a reason. It has a cult following, which if you're on any survival board or knife board or anything for fixed blades, you will quickly find it. And there's a reason. This thing is just great. It's not a gimmick. Next, I'd like to talk about the Ontario Sp5. You just pick this thing up and instantly you feel how quick it is. Lightest knife of the bunch, and it feels it. If you only have about 50 bucks, buy this knife if you need a big camp knife. And you do. It's great. There are things I would change about it, but that's true of almost any knife. Even with the Bk9, which I love so much, you know, I want that choil there. So there are downsides to it, but there's a whole lot of strengths. This knife chops really well. It does not take a lot of energy to chop because it's so lightweight, and this handle soaks up vibration very, very well. It doesn't beat on your hands when it comes to vibration, but this will tear your pinky up. And if you work with this knife, you know, most people take knives camping or surviving. They make a fire, they work the knife for an hour. if you're out there making traps, making a shelter, making a fire, doing a lot of really in-depth stuff, and you're working with a knife for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, you're going to start noticing this stuff. The handle's no good for that unless you're wearing gloves. But I'm telling you, for 50 bucks, made in America, this knife's hard to beat. The only one that might come close, which I want to test and review coming up here, is going to be the Ontario Kukri. So that's going to be interesting. Alright, the RTAK 2. This knife has a cult following almost like the Bk9. It was originally designed by Rowan. There's a lot of bad blood there, to be honest, although he's probably too much of a nice guy to say it, but there's a lot of politics behind this knife. But to leave all of that out of it, it's got this little choil here. Wish that was a little bit bigger. I like that the handles are removable. Now the handles are made a little bit oversized. The fit and finish on this isn't really great, but what that allows you to do is sand the handles down a bit to fit your hands. Basically, this knife is a giant hunk of 5160. It's one of the heaviest knives in this comparison. And but with these big handles, it hides its weight very well. This knife handles like a much smaller knife, but it packs a big punch, and that's probably why it did so well on this test. Handles are a little bit big for me. The shape is great, like the Becker, but love this knife. It's a little over $100 usually, but if you can afford it and you're looking for a budget chopper, you will not go wrong with this knife. This is unquestionably a very good knife. Alright, and finally let's talk about the Sp10. Hopefully I didn't hurt too many people's feelings with this knife. For everything that was good about this Kraton handle on the Sp5, it's bad on the Sp10. It vibrates more on your hands because the weight, maybe because the guard, beats your hands up with vibration, rips your skin up with this grippy Kraton. In fact, you can see a bit of the Kraton where it started wearing down on the back, and that's just because I guess my hand wore it down. There's so much friction there. You can't choke up on the blade because of this big dumb guard. I mean, if you need a knife and one of its main purposes is going to be knife fighting, this probably isn't going to be the knife to pick anyways. So the guard, I don't know why it's there. For looks, I mean, I think that this knife sells on aesthetics. It's got performance. If it's the only knife you have, it'll do it. For 50 bucks, it's still pretty dang cheap. It's made in America. It's a quality piece. The weight distribution though, the design, they all cater more to someone who's not going to spend a lot of time with a knife. If you're not going to spend a lot of time with a knife, maybe that's good for you, you know. Comes shaving sharp, good heat treat. I'm scared that the tip would be weak, but it hasn't broke. The grind is way too shallow. You know, it just doesn't want to chop through wood. It bounces. There's a lot of people on YouTube, and I always question their reviews, and they give this knife a really high review, but either they don't use it, or some of the people I've watched custom grind this knife and bring the grind way up on the blade. Well, yeah, if you hack half the metal off of it, it's not the same knife anymore. So you can't sit here and customize the heck out of a knife and then talk about how great it is. That's just silly. That's just like talking about how great your customization is. So this knife, you know, for me, for my purposes, you can watch it in action, just didn't work. Alright guys, so at the end of the day, what did we learn? We've got 4 knives here that are all affordable, that just work great. 3 of them are made in America, which is a huge plus. These knives range in price from $50 to $110, and really, if you get them on sale, it can be less than that. There's no reason to outsource your knife manufacturers to Pakistan, China, or Taiwan. Nepal, these guys are hand forging a differentially hardened knife at $70. That's crazy. This is not some communist country stamping out questionable products with questionable heat treat, questionable customer support, or whatever. This is meant, 4 men take an entire day to forge this blade out. This is different than any type of other chintzy thing in the world, and this is what Nepal is known for, is working knives. So definitely different than your cheap nation's manufacturer. But you're getting a lot of performance, but sometimes your fit and finish isn't going to be what you expect out of a manufactured knife. They work, and they're made by hand, by people making about $1.50 a day. It's an incredible design, stood the test of time. And then you've got your American counterparts. They have their own strengths and weaknesses, but overall, they're all performing knives, and they will all do large tasks and small. None of these knives are going to be as good as an axe if I need to make a permanent shelter. None of these knives are going to be good as a small carving knife if I need to make a spoon or a feather stick. But unlike a small knife, and unlike an axe in most cases, they'll do it all. And a lot of it they'll do really well. So I hope you enjoyed this series. I'm going to start doing some more series with different knives. Hopefully I'll control my variables a little bit better here and find ways to make make my videos a little more entertaining. I'm getting better equipment, I'm getting better at my editing, I'm getting better at my shooting. I'm going to have some exciting stuff coming up. If you guys have specific questions, make sure to let me know. If you're a manufacturer and you need a knife to be tested, let me know. And, subscribe, check out what I have to offer. It's always a pleasure having you guys. Talk to you in the comments section.